Hello and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in our study of Revelation with our focus today on chapter 13. This chapter is known as the vision of the two beasts. One beast arises out of the sea and a second beast out of the earth or land. Their job, scholars teach, is to support idolatry and are thus enemies of the Judeo-Christian God, with a capital G, in John's storyline. Recall in the previous chapter, it ended with the dragon, Satan, ejected from heaven and left standing on the seashore and in an angry mood, almost a warlike mood, you might say, with his aim to attack the offspring of the woman. Here, the sea emerging beast that joins in will be exercising, or that emerges here, will be exercising authority of that dragon, Satan. Scholars suggest that is symbolism for Rome. The beast that emerges from the land is more lamb-like, however, and it will be in direct support of that first beast, using deception mainly as its aid in this effort of idolatry. Thus, this second beast is often labeled as an antichrist or false Christ. Overall, these beast combination efforts are essentially to pose such a threat to humanity, the world's humanity or inhabitants, that the people will come to worship this beast, especially the beast Satan that preceded in the previous chapter. The alternative is to suffer death. In other words, for anyone who doesn't worship that beast, by extension, the beast being Rome, then will be required to either submit to this worship of the Roman God system, Satan system, if you will, as John sees it here, or suffer the consequences. And in either case, they suffer two sets of consequences. One is suffer death in the life here on earth, but salvation with God for standing fast. Or if they do accept, then they eternally suffer in hell. The blasphemous name that's referenced here means deification of the emperor, suggests Dr. Bruce Metzger, or Metzger, I should say, in his book Breaking the Code. The contrast is that those with the name of God and the Lamb on their forehead are those who inhabit the New Jerusalem. That is, they are the ones who've been loyal to God and Christ and do not become loyal to Rome or Satan. Several scholars teach this sea emerging beast clearly seems to be a combination of the three beasts that are in Daniel, the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. That is, in this one beast, we see the three beasts from Daniel: a leopard, a bear, and a lion. And whereas they're separate beasts in Daniel, it's one beast with those characteristics here. This beast is powered by the dragon Satan. The many crowns that are mentioned there, scholars suggest that is reference to the many kingdoms that are involved in making up the Roman Empire. possibly some would say the various provinces that make up Rome in that day and time. But others would argue it's more likely the multiple emperors that Rome has had and will continue to have as long as Rome survives. Notice this dragon beast is to be worshipped. The Anglican scholar Dr. Christopher Rowland says that role we must understand that in Judeo-Christian ethic, that role of worship is exclusive for God with the capital G. Not even the Lamb or Christ is to be worshipped, as we will see more strongly stated towards the end of the book of Revelation. In the last chapter, John will be told to strictly worship God alone and no angel. Some scholars suggest the message here is that the dragon Satan has transferred authority to these two beasts in an effort of deception to gain worshipers of him, ultimately. In other words, that's the ultimate aim. Their power and activities that are derived from Satan's power will be so influential and so amazing to convince the people of earth to treat Satan and honor him as they normally would reserve for God. It's kind of the idea, scholars say, that seems to be buried here in this storyline. Note there in verse 7 and 8 that implies that all those whose names are not in the Lamb's Book of Life will fall and worship that beast, thus committing blasphemy against God, to worship another god or another deity, if you will. And several scholars point out we have to realize that blasphemy was an unpardonable sin in the Judaism of the day. This lamb-like beast from the earth, scholars suggest, has the task of confusing and deceiving the population. Thus, it is often referred to as Antichrist. And John essentially makes that point here in the last chapter, or last of the chapter, I should say. Others prefer to call him a false prophet who functions like the Lamb in style, but of course very different in ultimate objective. Dr. Metzger taught that the second beast is symbolic for the underlings of the Emperor of Rome, as they carry out the orders of the first beast, who is the false god, that is, the Emperor of Rome is the false god, and the false Christ, if you will, he's describing as the underlings, the second order of authority. This is all in reference to, as we said, the deification of the Roman emperor. Several scholars suggest, especially modern scholars, seem to be pretty consistent there now. Worship of the emperor was initially in Rome, in the Roman Empire, was initially reserved only for the emperor upon death. But by Domitian's time, who was the emperor in John's day, in the 90s AD, it was the living emperor also. Domitian required his subjects for example, to address him as our Lord and God, that is, during the very time that he's still alive, with temples built for just that purpose throughout the provinces. Nero did it for a short time, but only for a short time, and a few others did it before on special occasions or special holidays and so forth. But it didn't become routine, didn't become the law of the land, so to speak, until this emperor dimension, historical scholars tell us. This chapter continues, or I should say, contains the references to the mark of the beast. And it's very well known for that. That mark is the number 666, is the way it's identified here in the book. What is that? Jews of the time identified it as belonging, that is the number 666, belonging to what was referred to as Caesar Nero. And they came up with that idea as the letters of that name, when written in Hebrew, using their numerical system, adds up to 666. But there are other variants of the book of Revelation that we see references to and partial manuscripts to that still are around, and the number reads 616 rather than 666. So how could that be? How could you have two different numbers? And scholars say that's pretty simple using that system, that the Latin spelling was Neron, Neron. The Greek is Nero. And that when you use the Latin spelling and transfer those letters into Hebrew, the score then turns out to be 616. The only indication John gives us here, specifically, he just says it indicates it is the name of a man, or represents a man, maybe is a better translation. But other scholars say, remember, other scholars that are going to present a completely different approach to this. And by the way, this approach I'm going to describe now is becoming more mainline among the scholars, is that this implies, well, first of all, I should say, we have to remember that numbers carried significant meanings in Judaism and early Christianity. We see John using numbers a lot. The number 7 especially, used a lot in Revelation, and usually is understood to mean completeness, full, finality, or perfection. And then based on that idea of what numbers mean in that late Judaism, early Christianity, thus there is a school of emerging thought that is, as I say, is beginning to become more popular, in which John is actually using this number 666 to mean he's not perfect. And so these scholars argue this on this grounds. Notice so far we've had 6 seals and 6 trumpets rather than 7, even though he says there will be 7 each time. But only 6 is presented. So this school of argument is that 666 Antichrist, beast, is going to appear or be nearly perfect, but not quite so. He falls short of perfection. Thus 666 is a metaphoric for a threefold falling short of perfection. And there are many scholars who are leaning more strongly in that direction in their writings now. Several literary scholars say, as written, just looking at it literally, at the literary aspects of it, I should say, it seems to carry clearly a metaphoric meaning and not a literal one. Whatever the 666 is, this mark of the beast has caught society's attention for a long time, says Dr. Brian Blount at Union Theological Seminary in Richmond. And he says, why? Because it involves commerce. That restriction on commerce by Christians was a major obstacle to late 1st century and early 2nd century AD Christians. Dr. Metzger taught that the imperial coins of that day all bore support for the emperor. It was considered an act of worship to use those coins. And so no one could legally buy or sell without that coin of worship. Who did it worship? The emperor as gods. Thus Christians could not use it, and certain sects of devout Jews could not use it, because it was an act of worship of a little g God instead of God. We might think that's a crazy idea, but we need to realize that all of our money in this country has "In God We Trust." We may not notice or think of that as a form of worship, but there have been cases requesting that our U.S. money be printed without that statement, especially by atheists, but there are other religious groups that have even brought it up, as they are being forced to worship a creed that violates their ethics by using government issued money in their normal acts of commerce that states "In God We Trust." So this idea may not be, if we stop and don't become so instantly angry and try to think this thing through, this may actually be an interesting point of discussion, and may explain this, as many scholars have said, that it was the aspect that Christians could not worship, and Rome knew that. They could not worship any God but God with a capital G, the Judeo-Christian God. Several scholars, both biblical and literary types, suggest that numbers likely had, and this number 666 likely had an unambiguous meaning among John's people. In the Greek, it does, as it's written here, it does not imply mystery. Instead, the literary scholars say the writing flows as if he expects his hearer or readers to immediately grasp it without further explanation, teaches Dr. Blount in his commentary. In the apocalyptic tradition, the number 7 clearly meant a complete or perfect value, and 6 was used by them, as we see in some other places, to imply lack of completeness or incomplete. In a side note, this number tied to Nero has, however, caused several scholars to hold fast to a completely different idea, and that is when this book of Revelation was written. As we said early on and have repeated, most scholars have dated this book to sometime in the mid-90s AD. But there is a significant school of thought that believes this happened in the 60s AD, prior to the destruction of the temple. And they used this number as one of the ways of sort of holding fast to the dating that it is prior to the loss of the temple when in 70 AD, and so they tend to go more to Nero because there is some references scattered about Nero as being the imperfect God or the imperfect emperor, and that multiple horns that's described, one of which is dead, is, some have indicated, a reference to Nero. So I just throw that in as a side note, that not everyone is on board that this is written in the 90s AD. I hope this gives you some idea of what chapter 13 has in it, at least through the eyes of several scholars, and hopefully we'll see you next week as we continue to study Revelation.